The carriage wheel cracked against a stone, and Elara Vance was thrown forward, her hand catching the seat just in time to stop her head from striking the wall. Outside, rain hammered the roof of the carriage like 100 small fists. She pulled back the curtain and saw the outline of a great house rising through the storm, its windows glowing gold against the darkness, and she felt her stomach tighten with a fear she had not expected. She had told herself the whole journey that this was only a position, nothing more. A governess and companion to a noble household. She needed the wages, and she needed them badly, because the small cottage she once shared with her father was gone, sold to pay debts she never knew he carried. All that remained of him now was the knowledge he had given her in secret, late at night, by candlelight, when he taught her languages the way other fathers taught their daughters embroidery: French, Italian, German, Latin, Greek, Russian, and the language of the East India merchants he had once worked among, which he called simply the trade tongue. 7 languages lived inside her mind, folded away like letters never sent, because a woman of her station was not supposed to know such things, and certainly was never supposed to say so. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door, rain streaming from his hat, and helped her down into the mud. She gathered her skirts and hurried toward the entrance of Fenwick Hall, her small trunk clutched against her chest, and did not look up until she stood beneath the stone archway, dripping and cold, facing a butler who studied her as though she were an unwelcome delivery. "You are the new companion," he said. It was not a question. "Elara Vance," she answered, and tried to keep her voice steady. "I was told to arrive by evening." "You are late," the butler said, though the storm outside made the reason obvious enough. He turned without further comment and led her through a hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced men in old coats, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. The house was vast, colder than she expected, filled with a silence that pressed against her ears. She was brought to a small sitting room where a woman sat near the fire, her posture perfectly straight, her gray hair pinned with precision. This was the Dowager Duchess, Margaret Fenwick, and though her face was lined with age, her eyes were sharp as a hawk's. "So you are the girl my son's man of business found for us," the Duchess said, studying Elara from head to toe. "You look half drowned." "The storm caught the road, Your Grace," Elara said, curtsying despite her damp skirts. "Sit," the Duchess said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "You will forgive me if I ask you plainly. My son believes hiring a companion for me is beneath his notice, and he has left the matter entirely in my hands. I intend to choose someone with more sense than airs. Tell me, girl, what do you know?" Elara hesitated. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, warning her gently that knowledge was a danger for a woman without a name or fortune to protect her. "Better to seem simple," he used to say, "and let the clever thing live only inside you." "I know how to read and keep accounts, Your Grace," Elara said carefully. "I can manage a household, and I am patient with children, if there are any in need of teaching." The Duchess's eyes narrowed, as though she sensed there was more behind the modest answer, but she did not press further. "That will do for now," she said. "You may begin in the morning. My son dines with guests this evening, and I expect you to stay out of sight until then." Elara was shown to a small room at the top of the house, plain but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand by the window. She set down her trunk and sat upon the edge of the bed, listening to the rain finally soften outside. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe. The following morning came bright and cold, sunlight spilling through the tall windows of the hall as servants moved briskly about their duties. Elara was given a plain gray dress to wear, suited to her new position, and led downstairs to begin her work under the housekeeper's watchful eye. It was there, crossing the main hall with an armful of linens, that she first saw the Duke. Alaric Fenwick stood near the study door, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark blue coat that fit him with the precision of wealth. His face was handsome in a hard, unyielding way, his jaw set as though he were perpetually displeased with something just beyond view. He was speaking with his steward about matters of the estate, his voice low and commanding, and he did not so much as glance at Elara as she passed. It was not until later that afternoon, when she was asked to bring a tray of correspondence to his study, that their paths truly crossed. She knocked softly and entered at his call, setting the tray upon his desk with practiced care. "You are the new companion my mother hired," he said, not looking up from his papers. "Yes, Your Grace, Elara Vance." He glanced at her then, briefly, the way a man might glance at a piece of furniture being moved into a room. "See that you do not fill her head with foolishness. My mother has grown fond of idle chatter in her old age, and I would prefer her companion have some use beyond gossip." Elara felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she kept her expression calm. I will do my best to be useful, Your Grace. See that you do, he said, already returning his attention to his papers. Girls hired for positions like yours rarely have much education beyond letters and needlework. I do not expect miracles. The words settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She wanted more than anything to answer him properly, to tell him that she had read philosophy in its original tongue before she was 15 years old, that she had translated letters for merchants when she was still a child, that her mind held more than he could imagine, standing there in his fine coat with his fine assumptions. But she said nothing. She only curtsied and left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. That evening, she took her supper alone in the small room off the kitchen reserved for the upper servants, and Henry Pruitt, the estate steward, joined her at the table with a kind smile. Do not mind the Duke, Henry said, noticing the tightness in her expression. He speaks that way to everyone new. He has a hard shell, that one, though I have known him since he was a boy, and there is more beneath it than he lets on. He seems certain of his opinions, Elara said carefully. Henry chuckled. Certain is one word for it. Stubborn is another, but you need not worry. The Duchess runs her own household, and she does not care much for her son's opinions when it comes to her companions. You will be fine here, Miss Vance. Elara offered a small smile in return, though privately she wondered how long she could remain silent beneath such careless judgment. She had come here to work, to earn her keep, and to keep her secret safe. She had not come to prove anything to a duke who had already decided what kind of woman she was before she had spoken a single true word to him. Over the following days, she settled into the rhythm of the household. She read to the Duchess in the mornings, walked with her in the gardens when the weather allowed, and managed small correspondence on her behalf. The Duchess, though sharp-tongued, grew fond of her quickly, appreciating her quiet competence and her careful attention to detail. The Duke, however, remained distant and cool. He passed her in hallways without acknowledgement, spoke to her only when necessary, and made small comments now and then about the limits of her education, as though testing how far her patience would stretch. Once, when she suggested a correction to a letter he had dictated, he looked at her as though she had spoken out of turn simply by noticing an error in his grammar, though she had said nothing more than a gentle observation. You need not concern yourself with matters beyond your position, he said coolly. I only meant to be helpful, Your Grace, Elara replied, keeping her tone even despite the sting of his words. Helpfulness has its place, he said, but knowing one's place has a greater one. She left the room that day with her jaw tight and her hands trembling slightly at her sides, not from sadness but from the effort of holding back words that would have changed everything too soon. She was not ready to reveal herself yet. Not to a man who had already judged her worth before she arrived. That night, as she prepared for bed, she took out a small book hidden in the lining of her trunk, a collection of poetry in Italian that had belonged to her father. She read a few lines silently to herself, feeling the familiar comfort of language settle her nerves. Somewhere below her window, she could hear laughter drifting from the drawing room, where the Duke entertained guests with easy confidence, certain of his place in the world, certain that people like her existed only to serve it. Elara closed the book and set it aside, extinguishing her candle. Whatever pride he carried, whatever assumptions he made about her, she knew something he did not yet understand. Silence was not the same as emptiness, and one day, when the moment came, she would not stay quiet at all. Sleep did not come easily. She lay in the darkness listening to the wind press against the old windows, thinking of her father's voice, of the years spent bent over worn books by candlelight, while other girls her age learned to dance and embroider. He had told her once that knowledge kept quietly was like a coal buried beneath ash, still burning, waiting only for the right wind to bring it back to flame. She had not understood him then. She understood him now. In the morning, she rose before the rest of the household stirred, dressed quickly, and made her way down to the kitchen to help prepare the Duchess's breakfast tray, as had become her habit. The cook, a broad woman named Alice Turner, greeted her warmly, and handed her a cup of tea before she had even asked. You are up early again, Miss Vance, Alice said. Most companions sleep until they are called. I find I sleep better with work ahead of me, Elara answered, and Alice laughed, shaking her head as she returned to her pots and pans. Elara carried the tray upstairs, moving quietly through the corridors still dim with early light. As she passed the study, she heard voices within, low and businesslike, and recognized the Duke speaking with his steward about a shipment delayed at the coast, spoken of in French by a merchant whose letter he could not fully translate. She paused only a moment outside the door, long enough to hear him mutter with frustration at a phrase he could not decipher, before continuing on her way, saying nothing, though the words had been simple enough for her to understand without effort. It was a small thing, that moment in the hallway, but it stayed with her through the day, a quiet reminder of how much closer the truth stood to the surface than anyone in that house yet realized. She wondered, walking on with the tray balanced carefully in her hands, how long it would be before that truth found its way into the light, and what the Duke would say when it finally did. The dining hall of Fenwick Hall blazed with candlelight, silver gleaming against white linen, and the low murmur of guests filled the room like the hum of a hive. Ilara stood near the wall, close enough to attend the Duchess if needed, dressed in a simple dark gown that marked her clearly as staff rather than guest. She had grown used to being invisible in rooms like this, a shadow among the wealth, and tonight she intended to remain exactly that. The guests had arrived that afternoon for a dinner marking the betrothal negotiations between the Duke and Miss Cordelia Ashworth, a beautiful young woman with pale golden hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Cordelia sat beside the Duke at the head of the table, her hand resting lightly on his arm whenever she spoke, her voice carrying the practiced sweetness of someone accustomed to admiration. Beside her sat her mother, and across from them, a portly gentleman named Lord Percival Hume, a family friend known throughout the county for his booming laugh and his sharper tongue. Ilara had learned quickly that Lord Hume enjoyed nothing more than finding weakness in others and pressing upon it until it bled. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that his attention would never fall upon her. It was during the second course, as servants cleared plates of roasted pheasant, that Lord Hume's gaze drifted toward her, standing quietly near the wall. "And who is this?" he said loudly enough for the table to hear. "The new companion my Lady Duchess speaks so highly of." The Duchess answered before Ilara could. "Miss Vance. She has been of great use to me these past weeks." "Of use?" Hume repeated, smiling in a way that made Ilara's skin prickle with unease. "Tell me, Miss Vance, what use can a companion be, beyond fetching shawls and reading dull letters aloud? I hear your kind rarely has schooling beyond the basics. Can you even write your own name properly, or does the Duchess do that for you as well?" A ripple of laughter passed around the table, some polite, some not. Ilara felt her face grow warm, though she kept her hands folded calmly before her. "I can write, my lord," she said evenly, "and read, and manage accounts, among other small things." "Small things indeed," Hume said, clearly enjoying himself now. "How charming. It must be a comfort to have such modest ambitions. Not every woman is fortunate enough to be born into learning, after all. Some must simply make do with what little they are given." The Duke, seated at the head of the table, said nothing at first, his attention seemingly fixed on his wineglass. But when Cordelia leaned toward him with a soft, knowing smile and murmured something Ilara could not hear, he looked up, and something in his expression hardened, as though he had decided to join the sport rather than end it. "Lord Hume speaks fairly," Alaric said, his voice carrying easily across the table. "I have found companions of Miss Vance's sort rarely possess education beyond the ordinary. It is no fault of hers. One cannot expect a servant's daughter to speak Latin or debate philosophy, and there is no shame in it." The words struck harder than Hume's mockery had, precisely because they came from him, spoken so plainly, so certain of their truth. Ilara felt something tighten in her chest, a mixture of humiliation and anger she had not expected to feel so sharply. She had told herself for weeks that his opinions did not matter, that she needed only to survive this position and move forward with her life. But hearing him speak of her so carelessly, in front of a room full of strangers, cut deeper than she wanted to admit. "I only meant to encourage her, Alaric," Hume said with false modesty, clearly pleased at how the conversation had unfolded. "A woman ought to know her limits, after all. It saves her the disappointment of reaching beyond them." "Quite right," Cordelia added sweetly, glancing at Ilara with something close to satisfaction. "Some things simply are not meant for every mind." Ilara said nothing. She stood very still, her hands folded, her expression carefully composed, though inside her something old and quiet stirred, a memory of her father's voice reminding her that pride born of ignorance was the easiest pride to shatter, if only the right moment arrived. That moment had not yet come. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break tonight. The Dowager Duchess, who had remained silent through the exchange, set down her fork with a sharp click against her plate. "I find Miss Vance's company more thoughtful than most of the conversation at this table tonight," she said coolly, her eyes moving from Hume to her son, with unmistakable disapproval. "Perhaps we might speak of something more worthy of our guest's time." The remark silenced the table for a moment, though Hume only chuckled and turned his attention to his wine, and Cordelia's smile did not waver, though her eyes flicked briefly toward Alara with something sharper than amusement. The Duke said nothing further, though he did not look at Alara again for the remainder of the meal. When the dinner finally ended and the guests retired to the drawing room for cards and conversation, Alara excused herself as quickly as propriety allowed, hurrying up the stairs to the small room she had come to think of as the only safe corner of the house. She closed the door behind her and stood with her back against it, breathing hard, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. She thought of her father again, of the nights he had spent teaching her verb conjugations and vocabulary lists long after she should have been asleep, of the quiet pride in his voice when she mastered a difficult passage. He had never once suggested her mind had limits. He had only warned her that others might assume so, and that the world was rarely kind to a woman who proved them wrong too quickly or too loudly. A soft knock came at her door some time later, and she opened it to find Henry Pruitt standing in the hallway, his expression gentle with concern. "I heard what happened at dinner," he said quietly. "Word travels fast among the staff. I am sorry, Miss Vance. Lord Hume is a cruel man when he wishes to be, and the Duke ought to know better than to encourage him." "It does not matter," Alara said, though her voice betrayed her more than she wished. "It matters," Henry said gently, "but do not let it wound you too deeply. People often speak loudest about things they do not understand. Perhaps one day they will understand you better than they think." Alara offered a small, tired smile, grateful for his kindness, even if she could not yet believe his words. "Thank you, Henry, truly." He nodded and left her to her rest, and Alara closed the door once more, sitting upon the edge of her bed in the quiet dark. She thought of the Duke's voice at dinner, so certain, so dismissive, and felt something shift within her, some final thread of patience beginning to fray. She was not angry at Lord Hume, whose cruelty was expected and unsurprising. She was angry at herself, for staying silent so long, for allowing a man who knew nothing of her to define what she was capable of, simply because it suited him to believe it. She did not sleep well that night. Instead, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning over old memories of her father's lessons, of languages spoken fluently in the quiet of their small cottage, of a mind built carefully over years, that no dinner party insult could ever truly diminish. Somewhere deep within her, a quiet resolve began to form, though she could not yet say what shape it would take, or when the moment might come for her to finally let her silence break. The following morning, she rose early as always, dressed, and made her way downstairs to begin her duties, determined not to let the previous evening show upon her face. She passed the drawing room where the remnants of last night's gathering still lingered, empty glasses and scattered cards left for the servants to clear. Cordelia's voice drifted from somewhere within the house, sharp and pleased, discussing wedding plans with her mother as though nothing unusual had occurred. Alara continued on her way, carrying the Duchess's morning tray, her expression calm though her thoughts remained far from settled. She did not yet know how or when, but she understood, with a clarity that steadied her more than she expected, that the world she had built around careful silence was beginning, slowly and inevitably, to crack. As she reached the top of the staircase, Cordelia stepped into her path, her golden hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour, her expression pleasant in a way that did not quite match the coldness in her eyes. "Miss Vance," Cordelia said, her tone light, "I do hope last night did not trouble you too much. Lord Hume can be blunt, but he means no true harm, and Alaric only spoke honestly. There is no shame in being what you are." "I was not troubled, Miss Ashworth," Alara replied, keeping her voice steady, and the tray balanced carefully in her hands. "Good," Cordelia said, though her smile sharpened slightly at the edges. "It would be unfortunate if you took offense at simple truths. A companion who cannot accept her place tends not to remain a companion for long. I would hate to see you lose such a comfortable position over wounded pride." The warning, though wrapped in soft words, was unmistakable. Alara held her gaze a moment longer than was perhaps wise, then offered a small, composed nod. "I understand my place well enough, Miss Ashworth. Thank you for your concern." Cordelia's eyes lingered on her a moment longer, as though searching for some crack in her composure, before she swept past with a rustle of silk skirts and descended the stairs toward the breakfast room. Alara stood still for a moment, steadying her breath, before continuing on to the Duchess's chambers. She found the Dowager Duchess already awake, seated by the window with a shawl draped over her shoulders, watching the gray morning light spread slowly across the gardens below. "You look pale this morning, Miss Vance," the Duchess said without turning from the window. "I trust last night's foolishness has not unsettled you too greatly." "I am quite well, Your Grace," Alara said, setting the tray upon the small table beside her. The Duchess turned then, studying her with the same sharp attention she had shown the first evening they met. "My son can be a fool when it suits him," she said plainly. "He inherited his father's pride, and very little of his patience, but do not mistake his words for the whole truth of him. There is more beneath that stubbornness than he often shows, though I confess even I grow tired of waiting for it to surface." Elara said nothing, unsure how to answer such a personal admission from a woman she still barely knew, though she felt a small measure of comfort in the Duchess's quiet honesty. "Tell me, Miss Vance," the Duchess continued, lifting her teacup with steady hands, "did Lord Hume's words truly not trouble you at all, or are you simply too well trained to admit it?" Elara hesitated, caught between careful discretion and the strange pull of honesty the older woman seemed to invite. "Perhaps a little of both, Your Grace," she admitted quietly. The Duchess allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "A sensible answer. Sensible enough that I begin to wonder, Miss Vance, whether there is not a good deal more to you than this household has yet discovered." The words settled over Elara like a held breath, close enough to the truth that her pulse quickened, though she offered only a modest smile in response and busied herself pouring the tea, saying nothing further on the matter. The Duchess did not press her, though her sharp eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary, as though filing the exchange away for later consideration. Later that day, word arrived by messenger that a foreign dignitary, a merchant of considerable importance from the Russian court, would be arriving at Fenwick Hall within the week to discuss trade matters with the Duke. The household stirred with sudden activity, servants preparing rooms, the cook planning elaborate menus, and the Duke himself pacing his study with evident tension, for none among his usual staff spoke the language well enough to manage such delicate negotiations comfortably. Elara, overhearing the commotion from the hallway as she carried linens toward the guest wing, felt a quiet, unexpected flicker of anticipation stir within her, though she said nothing, and continued on her way, her expression as calm and unreadable as ever. That evening she overheard the Duke speaking sharply with his steward in the study, his voice tight with frustration. "We have no one suitable to receive him properly," Alaric said. "My tutor from university has long since retired, and the merchant's letters arrive faster than any translator I can summon from town. If this negotiation fails for lack of proper courtesy, the loss will be considerable. Perhaps we might send to London for assistance, Your Grace," the steward suggested. "There is no time," Alaric replied curtly. "The man arrives within days, not weeks." Elara paused just beyond the study door, the tray of linen still balanced in her arms, listening to the worry in his voice, so different from the cold certainty he showed at dinner tables and in hallways. For a moment, she considered stepping forward, offering what she knew, ending the difficulty before it truly began. But she thought of Cordelia's warning on the staircase, of Lord Hume's mocking laughter, of how quickly her secret might be dismissed as a servant's foolish boast rather than believed as truth. She drew back instead, continuing on her way in silence, though the thought remained with her long into the night, turning over quietly in her mind like a key, waiting for the right lock to open. The carriage bearing the Russian merchant arrived at Fenwick Hall precisely at noon, its polished black frame gleaming despite the dust of the long road, and the entire household gathered near the entrance to receive him with proper ceremony. Elara stood near the back of the assembled staff, her hands folded before her, watching as the Duke stepped forward in his finest coat to greet the guest personally. The man who emerged from the carriage was tall and broad, with a thick gray beard, and sharp, assessing eyes that swept across the household with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to careful negotiation. He was introduced as Count Nikolai Orlov, a merchant of considerable standing at the Russian court, sent to discuss a trade arrangement of great importance concerning timber and iron exports that would affect the Fenwick estate's fortunes for years to come. The Duke bowed formally and offered a greeting in English, which the Count acknowledged with a polite nod, though his own understanding of the language proved limited at best. A translator had been arranged through a contact in London, a Mr. Whitfield, but a message had arrived only that morning explaining that illness had delayed his journey by several days, leaving the household with no one capable of bridging the gap between host and guest, beyond a handful of clumsy phrases the Duke had memorized in preparation. The dinner that evening was tense from its very beginning. The Duke attempted polite conversation through simple gestures and the few Russian words he had managed to learn, but the Count's responses grew increasingly formal and clipped, his patience visibly thinning as misunderstandings multiplied across the table. Lord Hume, seated nearby, offered no assistance whatsoever, clearly entertained rather than troubled by the growing awkwardness, while Cordelia watched with polite disinterest, more concerned with her own appearance than the diplomatic difficulty unfolding before her. Elara stood near the wall as she always did during formal dinners, attending quietly to the Duchess's needs, though her attention remained fixed on the increasingly strained exchange at the head of the table. She understood every word the Count spoke, understood the growing frustration beneath his carefully controlled expression, understood too the genuine anxiety building behind the Duke's composed exterior as the negotiation he needed so badly began slipping further from his grasp with each passing minute. The moment arrived without warning. Count Orlov, growing visibly impatient with the endless fumbling translations attempted by a junior clerk hastily summoned from the estate office, set down his utensils and spoke sharply in rapid Russian, his voice carrying clear irritation across the suddenly quiet table. The clerk, red-faced and overwhelmed, stammered an apology, admitting he understood barely a fraction of what had been said, and the table fell into an uncomfortable, heavy silence. "He says," the clerk finally managed, "that he questions whether this household holds any true respect for the arrangement, given that no one present can even properly welcome him in his own tongue. He says perhaps he has traveled a great distance for very little consideration." The Duke's jaw tightened visibly, his composure cracking at the edges as he glanced desperately around the table, searching for any solution to a problem he could not solve through wealth or title alone. Cordelia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and Lord Hume, for once, said nothing at all, sensing perhaps that even he understood the weight of what stood to be lost. It was then that Alara stepped forward from her place near the wall, her heart pounding against her ribs, though her voice, when it came, remained steady and clear. "If it would please your grace," she said quietly, "I believe I may be of some assistance." Every eye in the room turned toward her, disbelief plain on every face, and for a moment the Duke simply stared, as though she had spoken in a language he did not understand at all. "Miss Vance," he said slowly, "this is a delicate matter of trade. It requires precise translation, not idle guessing." "I understand that, your grace," Alara replied, holding his gaze steadily despite the trembling she felt beneath her calm exterior. "If you will permit me, I would like to try." The Duke hesitated, torn between skepticism and the obvious desperation of his situation, before finally giving a short, uncertain nod. Alara turned toward the Count and spoke, her Russian flowing smoothly and precisely, the words falling into place with the ease of long familiarity, carrying not only the literal meaning of the Duke's earlier apologies but the proper tone of respect and courtesy that had been so painfully absent all evening. Count Orlov's expression shifted immediately, surprise flickering across his weathered face before settling into something closer to genuine interest. He responded at length, his voice warmer now, more animated, and Alara translated his words back to the Duke with careful precision, explaining that the Count appreciated the sincerity of the apology and would be glad to continue their discussions properly, provided the household could offer someone capable of true communication going forward. The table remained utterly silent, every guest staring at Alara as though she had transformed before their eyes into an entirely different person. The Duke's expression, in particular, had shifted from disbelief into something far more complicated, a mixture of astonishment and something that looked almost like shame. "You speak Russian," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Yes, your grace," Alara answered simply. "How?" he demanded, though his tone had lost its earlier sharpness, replaced now with genuine bewilderment. "Where did a companion learn such a thing?" Alara hesitated only a moment before answering honestly, deciding there was little point in hiding further now that the truth had already announced itself so plainly. "My father taught me, your grace. He worked many years among merchants and diplomats before his passing, and he believed knowledge should not be wasted simply because circumstance made it inconvenient. I speak Russian, along with French, Italian, German, Latin, Greek, and the trade tongue used among the merchants of the East." A murmur rippled around the table, disbelief mingling with astonishment, and Lord Hume, who only moments before had mocked her so freely, sat with his mouth slightly open, clearly struggling to reconcile this revelation with his earlier cruelty. Cordelia's face had gone pale beneath her careful cosmetics, her earlier warning on the staircase suddenly ringing hollow and foolish, in light of what had just unfolded before the entire assembled company. The Count, sensing the shift in the room even without understanding every word spoken in English, turned to Alara with evident curiosity, asking through her own careful translation how a young woman came to possess such rare and varied learning. Alara answered him directly in his own language, explaining briefly and modestly, and the Count laughed warmly, delighted, remarking that he had traveled through many great houses across Europe and rarely encountered such unexpected talent hidden so quietly within a household staff. For the remainder of the dinner, Alara remained standing near the table, translating smoothly between the Duke and the Count as negotiations resumed with newfound ease and genuine warmth. The Duke, though visibly humbled, proved himself capable in the actual substance of the discussion, and the Count, pleased with the sudden clarity of communication, began speaking more openly about the terms he hoped to secure, terms that grew increasingly favorable as goodwill replaced earlier frustration. By the time dessert was served, the tension that had gripped the room earlier had transformed entirely into something resembling genuine camaraderie. The Count laughing heartily at a story the Duke managed to convey through Alara's careful translation, the table finally settling into the kind of comfortable conversation that had eluded them since the meal began. The Duke said very little to Alara directly for the remainder of the evening, though she noticed him glancing toward her repeatedly throughout the rest of the meal, his expression unreadable, caught somewhere between astonishment and something she could not quite name. When the dinner finally concluded and the guests retired toward the drawing room, he lingered a moment near the doorway as she gathered herself to return to her usual duties. "Miss Vance," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual sharp edges. "A word, if you would." She turned toward him, her pulse still quick from the evening's events, and waited. "You said nothing of this before," he said, his tone carrying more confusion than accusation. "Weeks you have been in this household, and you allowed me to believe you possessed nothing beyond the ordinary." "You never asked, Your Grace," Alara said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate honesty. "And I confess, I did not believe you would have wished to know, given your opinions on the matter." The words landed with visible weight, and the Duke's jaw tightened, though this time not from irritation but from something closer to genuine discomfort at hearing his own dismissiveness reflected back at him so plainly. "I spoke carelessly," he admitted, though the admission seemed to cost him some effort. "I judged you before I knew you, and that was unfair of me." Alara said nothing immediately, unsure how to respond to an apology, so unexpected from a man who had shown her little but cold indifference and casual cruelty since her arrival. "Thank you, Your Grace," she finally said quietly. "Though I confess, tonight was not about proving anything to you specifically. I only wished to help, given the difficulty of the moment." "Regardless of your intention," Alaric said, "you saved this negotiation from disaster. The terms Count Orlov has agreed to are far more favorable than I had any right to expect after tonight's rocky beginning. I am in your debt, Miss Vance, whether you sought that outcome or not." He studied her a moment longer, something new and considering in his gaze, before offering a slight, formal bow, the first genuine gesture of respect he had shown her since her arrival. "Good evening, Miss Vance," he said quietly, and turned to rejoin his guests, leaving Alara standing alone in the hallway, her heart still pounding from an evening that had changed everything, though she could not yet say precisely what would come of it. She made her way slowly back toward her small room at the top of the house, passing servants still buzzing with quiet astonishment at what they had witnessed, whispered conversations trailing behind her as she climbed the stairs. Word of the evening would spread quickly through the household, she knew, and likely far beyond it before long. She thought of her father again, of his quiet warning about knowledge kept too visible too soon, and wondered, not for the first time that night, whether she had just changed the course of her life entirely, for better or for worse, with a single unguarded moment of honesty at a crowded dinner table. Before she reached her door, she was stopped by the Dowager Duchess, who had followed her up the stairs at a slower pace, leaning slightly on her cane. "Miss Vance," the older woman said, her sharp eyes glinting with something close to delight. "You gave me quite a show tonight." "I did not intend to make a spectacle, Your Grace," Alara said, bowing her head slightly. "I only wished to help." "Nonsense," the Duchess said briskly. "You intended nothing of the sort, and that is precisely why it works so well. Tell me, how many languages did you say? 7? "Yes, Your Grace." The Duchess studied her for a long moment, tapping her cane thoughtfully against the floor. "I suspected there was more to you than you let on, from that very first evening in the rain. A woman does not carry herself the way you do, does not choose her words so carefully, without a mind trained for something greater than fetching shawls. I am pleased to have been proven right, though I confess I did not expect the proof to arrive quite so dramatically." "I hope I have not caused trouble, Your Grace," Alara said quietly. "Trouble," the Duchess repeated, almost amused. "My dear girl, you have caused my son to reconsider several assumptions he has carried since boyhood. That is not trouble. That is long overdue. Go and rest now. Tomorrow this house will look at you rather differently, and you will need your composure for it." The Duchess continued on toward her own chambers, leaving Alara standing alone once more in the quiet corridor, turning the strange events of the evening over and over in her mind. Down in the drawing room, however, the mood among certain guests remained far less generous. Lord Hume settled into a chair near the fire with a glass of brandy, his earlier good humor souring visibly the longer he considered what had transpired at dinner. A companion, he muttered to no one in particular, speaking Russian at my own dinner table, correcting my ignorance in front of a count. It is unnatural. It is embarrassing, Cordelia said sharply, seating herself beside him with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Everyone at that table saw Alaric humbled by a servant. Do you understand what that means for me? For this engagement? It means nothing has changed, Hume said, though his tone lacked conviction. A clever trick does not alter her station. She remains a companion, nothing more. A companion the Duke now looks at as though she hung the very stars, Cordelia snapped. You did not see his face at dinner. I did. That is not the expression of a man who has forgotten her by morning. Hume swirled his brandy thoughtfully, his earlier amusement fading into something more calculating. Then perhaps, he said slowly, we ought to remind him, and everyone else in this county, precisely what her station truly is. There are ways to ensure a companion's usefulness does not outlast her welcome, Cordelia, if one is patient enough to arrange them properly. Cordelia's eyes narrowed with sudden interest, the anger in her expression sharpening into something colder and more deliberate. Go on, she said quietly, leaning closer. I am listening. Neither of them noticed the young housemaid pausing briefly near the doorway with an armful of folded linens, nor did they realize how clearly their lowered voices carried into the hallway beyond, where Henry Pruitt happened to be passing on his way toward the kitchen stairs. He paused only a moment, his expression darkening slightly as he caught the tail end of their conversation, before continuing quietly on his way, filing the exchange away with the same careful attention he gave to every detail of the household he had served so faithfully for so many years. Upstairs, unaware of the quiet scheming already taking shape below her, Ilara finally reached her small room and sat upon the edge of her bed, still feeling the lingering flutter of nerves from the evening's events. She thought of the Duke's unexpected apology, of the strange softness that had entered his voice when he spoke of being in her debt, and wondered cautiously whether the coldness that had defined their acquaintance thus far might finally begin, slowly, to thaw. She did not yet know how quickly that fragile warmth would be tested, nor how determined certain members of the household had already become to see it extinguished before it had any true chance to grow. But for tonight, at least, she allowed herself the small, quiet comfort of having finally been seen for who she truly was, even if only for a single remarkable evening within the walls of Fenwick Hall. She rose once more before settling into bed, crossing to the small window that overlooked the dark gardens below. A single lantern still burned near the stable, its light flickering faintly against the night, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out over the quiet fields. She thought of the Count's warm laughter at the table, of the genuine respect in his eyes when he learned of her father's teachings, and felt, for the first time in a long while, a small measure of pride rather than caution settle over her heart. Her father had always told her that a woman's mind was not a candle to be hidden beneath a basket, but a light meant eventually to be seen, provided she chose the moment with care. She had chosen nothing tonight. The moment had chosen her instead, arriving suddenly amid crisis and necessity, stripping away weeks of careful restraint in a single unguarded breath. And yet, strangely, she did not regret it. Whatever difficulties tomorrow might bring, whatever quiet resentments now simmered among certain guests within the house, she found she could not summon regret for having finally spoken the truth of herself aloud. She drew the curtain closed and returned to her bed, and though her thoughts remained restless for some time longer, sleep eventually found her, carrying with it the first truly peaceful rest she had known since arriving at Fenwick Hall. Morning light spilled across the breakfast room where the household had gathered to bid farewell to Count Orloff, who departed in high spirits, praising the household's hospitality with a warmth that had been entirely absent upon his arrival. He clasped the Duke's hand firmly before boarding his carriage, and turned to Ilara with a broad smile, thanking her once more in his own language for her unexpected kindness, promising that word of her rare talent would surely travel with him back to more distant courts. When the carriage finally disappeared down the long drive, the household seemed to exhale collectively, the tension of the past days finally releasing its grip. Yet for Ilara, the days that followed brought a new kind of tension entirely, one born not of crisis but of sudden, unwelcome visibility. Servants who had once passed her without notice, now watched her with open curiosity, whispering among themselves whenever she walked past. Guests who visited the estate in the following weeks had clearly heard the story of the dinner, and several made a point of testing her, addressing her in halting French or fragments of Italian, delighted and astonished when she answered fluently and without hesitation. The Dowager Duchess, for her part, seemed to take great pleasure in the attention Elara now received, often steering conversations deliberately toward languages or literature, simply to watch her son's guests marvel at her companion's unexpected depth. The Duke himself proved the most changed of all. Where once he had passed Elara with barely a glance, he now found reasons to seek her out, though he approached the shift in their acquaintance with visible awkwardness, as though uncertain how to speak to a woman he had so thoroughly misjudged. It began simply enough, with small requests disguised as necessity. He asked her to review a letter arriving from a French vintner, claiming his own translation felt uncertain. He asked her opinion on a passage of Latin inscribed above the library's old fireplace, a phrase he admitted he had never properly understood despite passing it daily for most of his life. Each request grew slightly less necessary and slightly more personal, until one afternoon he simply appeared at the library door while she read quietly by the window and asked, without any pretense of business, what she was reading. "A collection of Italian poetry, Your Grace," Elara answered, looking up from the worn pages. "It belonged to my father." "Will you read some aloud?" he asked, somewhat hesitantly, as though surprised by his own request. "I confess I have always found the language beautiful, even when I understood none of it." Elara studied him a moment, searching for mockery in his expression and finding none, only a genuine, almost boyish curiosity that softened the hard lines of his face considerably. She began to read, her voice carrying the gentle rhythm of the verses, and the Duke listened in silence, his attention fully absorbed in a way she had never witnessed from him before. "What does it mean?" he asked when she finished the passage. She explained the poem's meaning carefully, translating not merely the words but the feeling behind them, the quiet ache of longing the poet had captured so delicately within his lines. The Duke listened intently, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "I misjudged you badly, Miss Vance," he said finally, "not only in doubting your education, but in assuming there was nothing worth discovering beneath the surface of your position. That was a foolish and unkind assumption, and I am sorry for it." "You need not apologize further, Your Grace," Elara said, though something in his sincerity moved her more than she wished to admit. "You have already said as much." "Perhaps," he said, "but I find myself wishing to say it properly, rather than in passing, as I did that first night." He hesitated, then added, "I would like, if you are willing, to know more of what you have learned, not merely as a curiosity for dinner conversation, but because I find I am genuinely interested." Elara felt a flush of warmth rise in her cheeks, unfamiliar and slightly unsettling, and she busied herself with the book in her lap to hide it. "I would not object to that, Your Grace," she said quietly. From that day forward, their exchanges grew steadily warmer, though never improper, always conducted within the bounds of careful propriety and the watchful presence of the household staff. He began joining her occasionally in the library during quiet afternoons, asking about her father's teachings, about the years spent learning languages most young women of her station never encountered. She found, to her surprise, that he listened with genuine attentiveness, asking thoughtful questions, rather than the careless dismissals she had grown accustomed to expecting from him. The Dowager Duchess observed this shift with quiet satisfaction, though she said little about it directly, content instead to encourage small opportunities for the two to interact, arranging for Elara to accompany them both on garden walks or inviting her to remain present during certain evening conversations that had previously excluded the household staff entirely. Not everyone in the household shared the Duchess's satisfaction, however. Cordelia grew increasingly cold toward Elara in the weeks that followed, her earlier veiled warnings sharpening into open hostility whenever the two crossed paths without witnesses present. She made pointed comments during dinners about the impropriety of a companion receiving such particular attention from her betrothed, and though the Duke dismissed these remarks with visible irritation, Elara noticed the tension building steadily beneath the surface of the household's daily routines. Lord Hune, too, remained a constant presence at Fenwick Hall throughout this period, visiting far more frequently than he had before the dinner with Count Orlov, always finding some pretext to linger near Cordelia in quiet corners of the house, their conversations dropping to whispers whenever Elara or other members of the staff passed too closely. Henry Pruitt, who had grown fond of Elara during her time at the estate, began watching the pair with visible concern, though he said nothing directly to Elara about his suspicions, uncertain whether his observations amounted to anything more than idle gossip. One afternoon, as Elara walked through the gardens gathering flowers for the Duchess's sitting room, she encountered the Duke unexpectedly along the same path, his expression thoughtful, almost troubled. "Miss Vance," he said, falling into step beside her. "May I ask you something rather direct?" "Of course, Your Grace." "Why did you never tell me the truth of your education, before that evening with Count Orloff? You allowed me to believe far less of you than was true, for weeks. I wonder now what that silence cost you, and why you chose to bear it rather than simply correct me." Alara considered the question carefully before answering, choosing her words with the same deliberate honesty she had shown him since that fateful dinner. "My father always warned me that a woman's education, however deep, could easily become a liability rather than an asset if revealed carelessly or to the wrong company. I had no reason to trust that you, of all people, would receive such knowledge kindly, given how plainly you had already dismissed me. I chose silence because silence felt safer than the risk of further ridicule." The Duke absorbed this answer in thoughtful silence, his expression carrying visible discomfort at hearing his own earlier behavior reflected so honestly back at him. "That is a fair judgment of my character at the time," he admitted quietly. "I hope I have given you some reason since to reconsider it." "You have, Your Grace," Alara said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it fully. They continued their walk in companionable silence for a while longer, the tension between them softened by something new and fragile taking careful root, though neither spoke further of it directly. Yet even as this quiet warmth continued to grow between them, Alara remained aware of the watchful, calculating eyes that followed her now throughout the household, and she could not entirely shake the uneasy sense that the peace she had found at Fenwick Hall remained far more fragile than it appeared on its calm and pleasant surface. That evening, as she returned to the house with an armful of freshly cut flowers, Cordelia intercepted her in the corridor outside the sitting room, her expression carefully arranged into something pleasant, though her eyes remained hard and calculating. "You and Alaric seem to spend a great deal of time together lately," Cordelia said, her voice light but pointed. "Garden walks, quiet afternoons in the library. One might almost mistake you for something other than a companion, Miss Vance." "We spoke only of literature, Miss Ashworth," Alara replied evenly, refusing to let the other woman's tone unsettle her composure. "Nothing more." "Of course," Cordelia said, though her smile did not reach her eyes. "I am simply concerned for your reputation. A companion who forgets her place too often tends to find herself without a place at all. I would hate to see such a talented young woman lose her position over a misunderstanding." "I appreciate your concern," Alara said carefully, "though I assure you, there is nothing improper in my conduct toward the Duke or anyone else in this household." Cordelia studied her a long moment, something colder passing briefly behind her polished expression, before she offered a final, tight smile and swept past without further comment. Alara stood alone in the corridor for a moment, the flowers still clutched in her arms, feeling the weight of the unspoken threat settle uncomfortably over her. Later that night, in the quiet study reserved for the household's private correspondence, Lord Hume and Cordelia met once more, their voices lowered though the urgency in their tone had sharpened considerably since their earlier conversation weeks before. "She grows bolder by the day," Cordelia said, pacing near the fireplace with barely contained frustration. "He looks at her now the way he never once looked at me. If this continues, the engagement itself may be at risk." "Then we must ensure it does not continue," Hume said calmly, swirling his brandy with practiced ease. "A companion's reputation is a fragile thing, Cordelia. It requires only a single, well-placed rumor to unravel entirely, particularly one suggesting impropriety unbecoming of her station. The Duke values his family's name above nearly everything else. Faced with genuine scandal attached to her presence, even his newfound fondness will not survive the weight of it." "What sort of rumor did you have in mind?" Cordelia asked, her earlier anger sharpening now into something more focused and deliberate. Hume smiled thinly, setting down his glass with quiet satisfaction. "Leave the details to me. I have connections among the local gossips who require very little encouragement to spread a convenient story, particularly one involving stolen items, or perhaps a secret suitor among the staff, something that paints our clever Miss Vance as far less innocent than she currently appears. By the time the truth might surface to correct it, the damage will already be thoroughly done." Cordelia considered this for a long moment, before nodding slowly, a cold satisfaction settling over her features. "Do it quickly, Percival. I want this resolved before the wedding announcement is finalized." Neither of them noticed, once again, the quiet presence just beyond the study door, where Henry Pruitt had paused on his evening rounds, his hand resting motionless on the handle of his lantern, as he listened to enough of their exchange to understand, with sudden and troubling clarity, that Alara's fragile new happiness within the household stood in far greater danger than she yet realized. He withdrew quietly, his expression grim, already turning over in his mind how best to warn her, and how much time might remain before whatever scheme Hume intended to set into motion. He found her the following morning in the small breakfast room off the kitchen, alone with her tea before the rest of the household had stirred. She noticed at once the seriousness in his usually cheerful face, and set down her cup, concern rising quickly within her. "Henry, what is it?" she asked. "You look as though you have not slept." "I overheard something last night," he said quietly, glancing toward the door to ensure they remained unobserved. "Lord Hume and Miss Ashworth, speaking in the study. They mean to see you removed from this household, Miss Vance, and they do not intend to do it honestly." Hume spoke of spreading a false rumor, something involving theft, or perhaps a secret suitor among the staff, anything that might paint you as unworthy of trust. Elara felt the warmth drain slowly from her face, though she kept her hands steady around her teacup. "I feared something of the sort might come," she admitted quietly. "Miss Ashworth has made her feelings toward me plain enough these past weeks." "You must be careful," Henry said earnestly. "Watch what you say, where you go, who sees you and when. Rumors need very little truth to take root, and even less to spread quickly through a household eager for something new to whisper about." "Thank you, Henry," Elara said, and meant it deeply. "I will be careful, and I am grateful, more than I can properly say, for your loyalty." He nodded, though the worry did not fully leave his expression as he rose to continue his morning duties, leaving Elara alone once more with her cooling tea, and the unsettling knowledge that whatever peace she had begun to find within the walls of Fenwick Hall now stood threatened by forces working quietly and deliberately against her, hidden just beneath the surface of the household's outward calm. The rumor began quietly, as such things often do, whispered first among the kitchen staff before spreading steadily upward through the household, like smoke seeping beneath a closed door. By the end of the week, Elara noticed the change plainly enough in the way certain servants glanced at her sideways, or fell silent when she entered a room, their earlier warmth replaced now with something guarded and uncertain. It was Alice Turner, the cook, who finally told her the truth of what was being said, pulling her aside one evening with obvious reluctance. "There is talk, Miss Vance," Alice said quietly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Talk that you have been meeting a man from the village in secret, and that certain items have gone missing from the guest wing since your arrival. I do not believe it myself, mind you, but the talk grows louder each day, and I thought you ought to know before it reaches ears that matter more than mine." Elara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach, though she kept her voice steady. "Thank you for telling me, Alice. None of it is true, I promise you." "I know that well enough," Alice said firmly. "But knowing the truth and stopping a rumor are two very different matters, I am afraid." The warning proved accurate sooner than Elara had hoped. Within days, the Dowager Duchess summoned her to her private sitting room, her expression graver than Elara had ever seen it. "Sit, Miss Vance," the Duchess said, gesturing to the chair opposite her own. "I have heard troubling things, and I would have your account of them before I decide what to believe." "I would be glad to answer anything you ask, Your Grace," Elara said, seating herself carefully, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "It is said you have been meeting secretly with a man from the village," the Duchess began, "and that a valuable brooch belonging to one of our recent guests has gone missing from the guest wing, last seen the same week these secret meetings supposedly began. Tell me plainly, is there any truth in either matter?" "None whatsoever, Your Grace," Elara said firmly, meeting the Duchess's sharp gaze without flinching. "I have met no one from the village in secret or otherwise, and I know nothing of any missing brooch. I would swear to both on my father's memory, if such an oath would satisfy you." The Duchess studied her for a long, silent moment, her expression unreadable. "I believe you, Miss Vance," she said finally, though her tone remained troubled. "You have given me no reason yet to doubt your honesty, but belief alone may not be enough to satisfy others in this household, particularly if the missing item is not recovered, and particularly given how quickly this rumor has spread." "Do you know who began it, Your Grace?" Elara asked carefully. "I have my suspicions," the Duchess said, her eyes narrowing slightly, "though suspicion is not proof, and I will not accuse anyone without cause, however tempting it might be. Be careful, Miss Vance. Watch yourself closely in the coming days. I fear this matter has not yet reached its worst point." The Duchess's warning proved prophetic within a matter of days. Elara returned to her small room one evening to find it had been searched, her belongings disturbed, her trunk left slightly ajar, though she was certain she had locked it that morning. Her heart pounded as she searched through her few possessions, relief flooding through her only when she confirmed nothing had actually been taken. But relief turned quickly to dread when, the following morning, a housemaid discovered the missing brooch tucked carefully beneath the lining of Elara's trunk. exactly where a search would eventually uncover it. The household erupted into chaos within hours. Alara was summoned to the Duke's study, where she found not only Alaric but also his mother, Lord Hume, and Cordelia already assembled, the missing brooch resting upon the desk between them like a damning piece of evidence laid bare for judgment. "Explain this," the Duke said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, though Alara could not immediately discern whether it carried anger or genuine confusion. "I did not take it, Your Grace," Alara said, her voice steady, despite the fear building rapidly within her chest. "I have never seen that brooch before in my life. Someone must have placed it among my belongings deliberately." "How convenient an explanation," Cordelia said sharply, though her satisfaction was poorly concealed beneath her feigned outrage. First a secret suitor, and now theft. Perhaps her hidden education was never the only thing she kept concealed from this household. "That is enough, Cordelia," the Duchess said sharply, though her sharp eyes remained fixed on Alara, searching for any sign of deception. "With respect, Your Grace," Lord Hume interjected smoothly, "the evidence speaks plainly enough. The brooch was found among her possessions. Whatever talent she demonstrated at dinner some weeks ago does not erase the possibility of dishonesty elsewhere. Perhaps her cleverness extends further than mere languages." Alara felt the walls of the study pressing in around her, the weight of their accusations settling heavily over her chest, though she forced herself to remain calm, to think clearly despite the panic threatening to overwhelm her composure. "Your Grace," she said, turning directly to the Duke, "I understand how this appears, but I ask you to consider who among this household might benefit from seeing me disgraced and removed. I have made no enemies here that I know of, save perhaps those who resent the attention my education has brought me." Cordelia's face flushed with sudden anger. "Are you suggesting I had some hand in this?" "I am suggesting nothing directly, Miss Ashworth," Alara said carefully, though her meaning remained unmistakable. "I am only asking His Grace to consider the matter fully before reaching any conclusion." The Duke's gaze moved slowly between Alara and Cordelia, his expression conflicted, torn visibly between the physical evidence before him and something deeper, some instinct he could not fully articulate that resisted the easy conclusion the moment seemed to demand. "This requires further investigation," he said finally, his voice measured despite the tension evident in his posture. "Miss Vance will remain confined to her quarters until the matter is properly resolved. I will not condemn her on circumstance alone, but neither can I ignore what has been found." Alara was escorted from the study under the careful watch of a footman, her mind racing as she climbed the stairs toward her small room, now feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a prison awaiting formal sentence. She sat upon the edge of her bed once the door closed behind her, her hands trembling now that she was finally alone, the fear she had held so carefully in check throughout the confrontation finally breaking free. She thought of her father, of the years he had spent teaching her patience alongside language, of his gentle insistence that truth, however delayed, eventually found its way to the surface if one remained steady enough to wait for it. She held tightly to that memory now, though the uncertainty of her situation pressed heavily against her resolve. Sometime later, a soft knock came at her door, and she opened it cautiously to find Henry Pruitt standing in the corridor, his expression grim but determined. "I have been thinking on this since it happened," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder to ensure they were not observed. "I overheard Hume and Miss Ashworth planning something like this weeks ago, as I told you before. I believe now is the time I must speak of what I heard to the Duke directly, whatever the consequence to myself for having stayed silent so long." "Henry, you need not risk your position over this," Alara said, though gratitude flooded through her at his willingness to help. "I risk far more by staying silent while an innocent woman suffers for another's scheming," Henry said firmly. "I will speak with the Duke tonight, Miss Vance. Have faith a little longer." He left her with that promise, and Alara spent the remainder of the evening pacing her small room, alternating between hope and despair as the hours passed slowly by. She thought of the Duke's expression in the study, the visible conflict in his eyes, and wondered whether that flicker of doubt might be enough, in the end, to save her from the fate Cordelia and Hume had so carefully constructed. Late that night, she heard raised voices echoing faintly from somewhere below her room, though she could not make out the words clearly enough to understand what was being said. She remained awake long into the night, listening to the distant sounds of the household stirring restlessly around her, uncertain whether the commotion signaled hope or further disaster, and unable to do anything but wait, helplessly, for whatever morning would finally bring. By the time dawn's pale light finally crept through her window, exhaustion had worn her fear down into a dull, aching resignation, though sleep had never truly come. She rose, dressed carefully despite her uncertainty, and waited by her door, listening intently for any sign of what the coming day might hold, her fate still resting uneasily in the hands of others while the truth she so desperately needed acknowledged remained, for now, unspoken and unresolved. The raised voices she had heard the night before belonged, in fact, to Henry and the Duke, meeting privately in the study long after the rest of the household had retired. Henry had approached with visible nervousness, aware of the risk he took in speaking against a guest of Lord Hume's standing, but he had steadied himself with the memory of Ilara's steady kindness toward every member of the staff since her arrival, and pressed forward regardless. "Your Grace," he had said, standing stiffly before the Duke's desk, "I ask your patience for what I am about to tell you, and I ask that you judge my words on their own merit, whatever trouble they may cause me. Speak plainly, Henry," Alaric had said, setting down the papers he had been reviewing with visible weariness. "This household has had enough of half-truths this week already." "Some weeks past," Henry began, "I overheard Lord Hume and Miss Ashworth speaking privately in this very study. They spoke of Miss Vance's growing closeness with you, Your Grace, and of their fear that it threatened the engagement. Lord Hume proposed spreading a false rumor to see her removed from the household, something involving theft or an improper suitor, precisely the sort of accusation that has now come to pass. I did not think it my place to speak of it then, hoping perhaps it was idle talk that would come to nothing. I see now I was gravely mistaken to stay silent so long." The Duke had gone very still, his expression darkening steadily as Henry spoke, disbelief giving way slowly to something colder and more focused. "You are certain of what you heard?" "As certain as I am standing here now, Your Grace," Henry said firmly. "I would swear to it before any authority you choose to summon." The Duke had risen from his desk then, pacing the length of the study with barely contained agitation, turning the revelation over in his mind alongside everything else he had witnessed in recent weeks. The sharpness in Cordelia's manner whenever Ilara's name arose, the strange satisfaction he had noticed in Hume's expression during the confrontation in his study that very afternoon. Pieces he had not fully examined began arranging themselves into a far more troubling picture than the simple theft he had been prepared to accept at face value. "Thank you, Henry," he had said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "You were right to come to me, however long you delayed. I will see this matter resolved properly, and I will not forget your honesty in bringing it forward." Henry had bowed and departed, leaving the Duke alone with his thoughts long into the night, the raised voices Ilara had heard from her room belonging not to conflict between the two men, but to the Duke's own furious pacing and the sharp questions he had begun sending, through hastily written notes, to members of the household staff who might confirm or deny what Henry had told him. By the time morning arrived, the Duke had gathered enough small confirmations from careful questioning of the housemaids and footmen, several of whom admitted, once pressed directly, to overhearing fragments of conversation between Hume and Cordelia in recent weeks that aligned uncomfortably well with Henry's account. One young housemaid, trembling with evident guilt, finally confessed under gentle but firm questioning that she had been paid a small sum by Lord Hume to place the missing brooch within Ilara's trunk, believing at the time it was merely a harmless prank, rather than a deliberate act of cruelty intended to destroy an innocent woman's reputation and position entirely. Armed with this mounting evidence, the Duke summoned the entire household to assemble in the main drawing room that very morning, his expression carrying a controlled fury that unsettled even the most seasoned members of his staff. Word reached Ilara in her confined quarters shortly after sunrise, delivered by a nervous footman, who informed her only that she was to dress and await further instruction, offering no further explanation for the sudden summons that now filled her with a fresh, uncertain dread, entirely separate from the exhaustion of her sleepless night. She dressed carefully, steadying her hands as best she could, and waited by her door once more, wondering whether this new summons signaled her final vindication or some further trial she had not yet anticipated. Whatever awaited her below, she resolved to face it with the same quiet composure that had carried her through every difficult moment since her arrival at Fenwick Hall, though the uncertainty of what the coming hour might bring pressed heavily against even her most carefully practiced calm. When the footman finally arrived to lead her downstairs, she found the corridor outside the drawing room already crowded with staff, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern as she passed among them. Alice Turner offered her a small, encouraging nod from near the kitchen stairs, and even the usually stern butler inclined his head slightly as she walked by, small gestures that steadied her nerves more than she expected. The drawing room itself had been arranged with unusual formality, chairs set in a wide circle rather than their usual comfortable clusters, the morning light streaming through tall windows to illuminate every corner of the room with unflinching clarity. The Dowager Duchess sat near the fireplace, her expression unreadable but watchful, while the Duke stood near the center of the room, his posture rigid, his gaze sweeping the assembled gathering with a coldness Ilara had not seen from him since their earliest, most difficult encounters. Cordelia and Lord Hume sat together near the far window, and Ilara noticed immediately the faint uncertainty beginning to creep into their expressions, a flicker of unease that had not been present during the confrontation in the study the previous day. Something had shifted overnight, she realized, though she could not yet say precisely what, and she took her place near the doorway as instructed, her heart pounding steadily as she waited for whatever would come next to finally unfold before the assembled household. Henry stood quietly near the far wall, his gaze meeting hers briefly across the room, and in the small, steady nod he offered her, Ilara found the first true glimmer of hope she had allowed herself since the brooch had been discovered among her belongings. Whatever conversation had passed between him and the Duke through the long hours of the night, it had clearly set something significant into motion, though the shape of it remained hidden from her for now. The Duke cleared his throat, and the low murmur of the assembled staff fell silent at once. "I have gathered you all this morning," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the room, "because a grave injustice was nearly committed within these walls, and I will not allow it to stand unresolved a moment longer than necessary. What I have learned since yesterday afternoon has changed my understanding of recent events considerably, and I intend to see the full truth of the matter laid plainly before everyone gathered here." A ripple of unease passed visibly across Cordelia's expression, and Lord Hume shifted slightly in his seat, his earlier confidence noticeably absent from his posture now. Ilara stood very still near the doorway, scarcely daring to breathe, as the Duke turned his attention deliberately toward the pair seated near the window, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath along with her, waiting for whatever reckoning was about to unfold. "Lord Hume," the Duke said, his voice carrying a cold precision that silenced whatever remained of the murmuring throughout the room. "Last night, I learned that you proposed a scheme to see Miss Vance falsely accused of theft, in order to protect a betrothal you believed her presence threatened. I have since confirmed, through the testimony of my own steward and the confession of a young housemaid paid for her part in the deception, that the brooch discovered in Miss Vance's belongings was placed there deliberately, at your direction, and with Miss Ashworth's full knowledge and consent." The room erupted into startled murmurs, several staff members exchanging shocked glances, while Cordelia's face drained of all color, her earlier composure crumbling rapidly beneath the weight of the accusation now spoken plainly before the entire household. "This is absurd," Hume said, though his voice lacked its usual booming confidence, cracking slightly at the edges. "You would take the word of a servant over that of a gentleman, Alaric? Over your own betrothed? I would take the word of an honest man over that of a liar, regardless of station," the Duke replied evenly. "Henry has served this household faithfully for over a decade, without a single mark against his character in all that time. You, on the other hand, arranged a cruel deception against a woman who has done nothing but serve this household with intelligence and grace since her arrival. I have also spoken this morning with the young maid you paid to plant the brooch, and she has confirmed everything, in writing, before witnesses." Cordelia rose suddenly from her seat, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and indignation. "Alaric, please, you must understand, I only feared losing you. She arrived and everything changed so quickly, and You conspired to destroy an innocent woman's reputation and livelihood out of jealousy," the Duke said, cutting her off with a firmness that left no room for argument. "There is no justification for such cruelty, Cordelia, regardless of the fear or insecurity that drove you to it. I cannot, in good conscience, continue any engagement built upon such deception." A heavy silence fell over the room as the weight of his words settled fully upon everyone gathered there. Cordelia's mother, seated near the back of the room, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, clearly as shocked by the revelation as anyone else present, while Cordelia herself stood frozen, her earlier confidence entirely dissolved into visible panic. "You cannot mean to end our engagement over the word of servants," Hume said, attempting one final desperate defense, though the tremor in his voice betrayed how little conviction remained behind the words. "I mean precisely that," the Duke said, turning his attention fully toward Hume now, his expression carrying a controlled anger that seemed to fill the entire room. "And I will be informing the appropriate authorities of your role in this scheme, Lord Hume. Deliberately fabricating theft against an innocent servant is no small matter, whatever your standing in this county. I suggest you consider carefully how you wish to answer for it." Hume's face paled considerably at this final declaration, and he rose stiffly from his seat, casting one final, venomous glance toward Ilara before departing the room without another word, his earlier bravado entirely abandoned in the face of consequences he had clearly never anticipated facing so directly. The Duke then turned toward Alara, who stood still near the doorway, scarcely able to believe the swift and thorough vindication unfolding before her. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice softening considerably as he addressed her directly, "I owe you a debt far greater than mere apology. I allowed suspicion to cloud my judgment, even briefly, and for that, I am truly sorry. You have shown this household nothing but honesty and grace since your arrival, and I intend to see that fully and publicly acknowledged, starting today." "Thank you, Your Grace," Alara said, her voice unsteady with relief, though she managed to keep her composure before the assembled crowd. "I am simply grateful the truth has finally come to light." The Dowager Duchess rose from her seat near the fireplace, moving to stand beside Alara with evident pride. "I never doubted you, Miss Vance," she said warmly, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Not for a single moment. It seems my judgment of character remains as sound as ever, even when my son's occasionally falters." A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the room, easing some of the lingering tension, and Alara felt tears finally threatening at the corners of her eyes, though this time from relief rather than fear. Cordelia, still standing near the window, seemed to shrink further into herself as the room's attention shifted entirely away from her, the full extent of her social ruin settling slowly and painfully across her stricken features. "I believe," Cordelia's mother said quietly, rising to gather her visibly shaken daughter, "we should take our leave, Your Grace. I am deeply sorry for the pain my daughter's actions have caused this household, and Miss Vance in particular. We will trouble you no further." The Duke inclined his head in acknowledgement, though he said nothing further to soften their departure, watching in silence as Cordelia was led from the room, her earlier confidence and cruelty replaced now with a humiliation entirely of her own making. The remaining household staff slowly dispersed as well, whispered conversations trailing behind them, though the tone of the whispers had shifted entirely, carrying now a mixture of sympathy and quiet admiration for Alara rather than the earlier uncertainty and suspicion. In the days that followed, the household settled gradually back into its familiar rhythms, though something fundamental had shifted within its walls. The Duke sought Alara out far more openly now, no longer disguising his visits to the library with pretenses of business or borrowed books. Their conversations grew longer, warmer, filled with genuine curiosity and mutual respect that neither of them attempted to hide any longer from the watchful, approving eyes of the household staff. That same evening, once the household had finally settled and the excitement of the morning's revelations had quieted into calmer conversation, Alara sought out Henry in the small room off the kitchen where she had first shared supper with him on her very first night at Fenwick Hall. "I do not know how to thank you properly," she said, taking a seat across from him at the familiar table. "You risked your position, perhaps more, to see justice done on my behalf." "You need not thank me, Miss Vance," Henry said, though a pleased smile crossed his weathered face. "I have watched this household long enough to know cruelty when I see it forming, and I could not stand by and let it take root against someone who deserved far better treatment than she received. Besides," he added with a small chuckle, "I always did believe there was more to you than met the eye, from that very first stormy evening you arrived." "You never said so," Alara replied, smiling despite the exhaustion still lingering from the day's events. "A man learns discretion, working in a house such as this," Henry said, "but I am glad, truly glad, to see your worth finally recognized as it should have been from the start." Word of the morning's dramatic revelations spread quickly beyond the walls of Fenwick Hall in the days that followed, carried first by departing guests, and then by the letters that inevitably followed such scandal through the county's tightly connected society. Cordelia's family withdrew almost entirely from public gatherings for some months afterward, the shame of their daughter's scheming proving difficult to escape even at a comfortable distance from Fenwick Hall itself. Lord Hume, true to the Duke's promise, found himself facing formal inquiry into his conduct, his reputation among the county's gentry suffering considerably as the details of his scheme became more widely known. Alara, meanwhile, found her own position within the household transformed almost entirely. The Dowager Duchess began introducing her to visiting guests not merely as a companion, but as a woman of remarkable education and character, often recounting the story of the dinner with Count Orlov with evident relish, watching new acquaintances marvel at the tale with the same astonishment the original guests had shown. Alara accepted this new attention with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout her difficulties, neither seeking the spotlight nor shrinking from it when it inevitably found her. She wrote a long letter to herself one evening, addressed to no one but the memory of her father, describing everything that had happened since her arrival at Fenwick Hall, the humiliation and the vindication both, the fear and the unexpected warmth that had followed it. She kept the letter tucked within the same worn book of Italian poetry that had once belonged to him, a private record of how far she had come since those quiet nights of secret lessons by candlelight, when she never could have imagined her hidden education might one day silence a room full of nobility and change the entire course of her life so completely. One afternoon, several weeks after Cordelia and Lord Hume's departure from Fenwick Hall, Ilara found herself once again in the garden, gathering flowers as she often did for the Duchess's sitting room, when the Duke appeared along the same familiar path, his expression carrying a quiet nervousness she had rarely witnessed from him before. "Miss Vance," he said, falling into step beside her, as he had done so many times before, "I find myself wishing to ask you something, though I confess I have rehearsed the words rather poorly." "You may ask me anything, Your Grace," Ilara said, setting down her small basket of flowers, curious at the unusual hesitation in his manner. "These past months," he began, "have changed my understanding of a great many things, not least among them my own foolish assumptions about worth and station. You arrived at this household as a stranger I judged unfairly within moments of our first meeting, and you have since become someone whose company I find myself seeking out more than any other, someone whose mind and character I admire more deeply than I ever expected to admire anyone at all." Ilara felt her heart quicken, though she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I am aware," he said, "that the difference in our stations remains considerable, and that society may raise objections I cannot fully anticipate. But I find I no longer care as much for such objections as I once believed I would. Ilara, I would like, if you are willing, to court you properly, openly, with every intention of eventually asking for your hand, should you find yourself willing to accept a man who took far too long to recognize your true worth." The garden around them seemed to grow suddenly quiet, the afternoon sun warm against Ilara's face as she considered his words, her heart full with an emotion she had not expected to feel so completely within these walls that had once felt so cold and unwelcoming during her very first rain-soaked evening here. "I would be glad to accept your courtship, Your Grace," she said finally, a genuine smile breaking across her face for perhaps the first time since her arrival. "Though I confess, I never expected the Duke who once called me uneducated to become the man now standing before me." Alaric laughed softly, the sound warm and unguarded in a way she had rarely heard from him before. "Nor did I ever expect to be so thoroughly humbled by 7 languages spoken so effortlessly across a single dinner table. I believe, Miss Vance, you have taught me a great deal more than languages these past months." They continued their walk together through the garden, the warm afternoon light stretching long shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges, and Ilara felt, for the first time since her father's passing, a genuine sense of belonging settle firmly around her heart. Whatever challenges still lay ahead in blending two such different worlds, she faced them now not with the quiet caution of a woman hiding her true self, but with the steady confidence of someone finally, fully seen and valued exactly as she was. The Dowager Duchess, watching quietly from her window overlooking the garden, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile as she observed the pair walking slowly together below, her earlier instincts about the remarkable young companion she had hired that stormy evening, finally proving themselves entirely correct. Fenwick Hall, once so cold and rigid in its old certainties, had begun, slowly and surely, to change for the better, all because one quiet young woman had finally found the courage to let her silence break. News of the courtship spread through the household within days, greeted not with the whispered scandal that had once surrounded Ilara's arrival, but with genuine warmth and celebration among the staff who had come to admire her steady kindness over the preceding months. Alice Turner baked a special cake to mark the occasion, insisting it was only proper given how much the kitchen staff had come to care for Miss Vance during her time at the hall, and Henry raised a quiet toast in her honor during the servants' evening meal, his pride in her evident to everyone gathered around the table. The Dowager Duchess, delighted beyond measure at the turn of events, took it upon herself to begin planning a formal announcement dinner, insisting that Ilara's remarkable story deserved to be told properly before the county's assembled society, rather than left to spread merely through gossip and rumor. She spoke often in the weeks that followed of how proud she was to have trusted her instincts that first stormy evening, when a drenched and exhausted young woman had arrived at her door carrying far more within her than anyone in the household could have possibly guessed. The formal dinner, when it finally arrived, filled the same dining hall that had once witnessed Ilara's humiliation at Lord Hume's cruel hands, now transformed instead into the setting for her formal introduction as the Duke's intended. Guests who had once mocked her modest station now offered warm congratulations, and several, remembering the story of Count Orlov's visit, asked eagerly to hear her speak a few words in one language or another, delighting in the ease and grace with which she obliged them. Alaric stood beside her throughout the evening, his earlier pride and coldness replaced entirely by an open admiration he made no effort now to conceal. When at last he rose to address the assembled guests, he spoke plainly of his own earlier prejudice, admitting before the entire gathering that he had once dismissed Alara's worth, based on nothing more than assumption and pride, and that she had taught him, through patience and quiet strength rather than argument, the great folly of judging another person's mind before ever truly knowing it. "I stand before you tonight," he said, raising his glass toward her with evident affection, "a far wiser man than the one who first greeted Miss Vance in this very hall some months ago. I am grateful, more than words can properly express, that she chose patience over bitterness in the face of my earlier foolishness, and I intend to spend a great deal of my future proving myself worthy of that patience." The guests raised their own glasses in warm response, and Alara felt, standing there amid the glow of candlelight and genuine celebration, a happiness so complete it nearly overwhelmed her composure entirely. She thought once more of her father, of the quiet lessons learned by candlelight in a small cottage far removed from grand dining halls and noble titles, and understood at last the full truth of what he had always tried to teach her. Knowledge kept quietly was never truly wasted, only waiting patiently for the moment it was finally needed, ready always to rise when the world least expected it, and to change, in its own quiet way, everything that followed. Spring arrived at Fenwick Hall the following year, with a warmth that seemed to settle over the entire estate, the gardens blooming in full color for the first time since Alara had arrived there in the cold rain of the previous autumn. She stood now at the same window in her old room, though she rarely slept there anymore, having been given far grander quarters within the house since her engagement to the Duke had been formally announced to the county. The wedding itself had taken place only weeks before, a quiet but joyful affair attended by the Dowager Duchess with visible pride, by Henry and Alice and the rest of the household staff, who had grown to love Alara during her time among them, and by a small handful of distant relations who had come to accept, gradually, the unconventional match their family had made. Cordelia's family sent no acknowledgement of the event, and neither Alara nor Alaric expected one, content instead to build their life together without concerning themselves further with those who had once sought to tear it apart. Count Orlov himself had sent a generous gift from Russia upon hearing news of the wedding, along with a warm letter expressing his delight that the remarkable young woman he had met that memorable evening had found such happiness, and expressing his hope that their trade arrangement, now flourishing steadily thanks to the goodwill established that night, might continue for many years to come. Alara kept the letter carefully among her most treasured possessions, alongside her father's worn book of Italian poetry and the private letter she had once written to his memory, a quiet record of how thoroughly her life had transformed since that stormy carriage ride toward an uncertain future. Life as the Duchess of Fenwick, Alara soon discovered, carried its own particular challenges, quite different from the ones she had faced as a companion. She found herself navigating the complex expectations of noble society with the same careful precision she had once applied to translating difficult texts, learning quickly which battles were worth fighting and which were better left to quiet, patient persistence. Not every member of the county's gentry welcomed her warmly at first, some clinging still to old prejudices about station and birth that no amount of demonstrated brilliance could fully dissolve. But she faced their coldness with the same steady composure that had carried her through every difficulty at Fenwick Hall, confident now in a way she had never quite managed during those early uncertain weeks, secure in the knowledge of her own worth, and in the genuine love and respect of the husband who stood firmly beside her through every challenge. Alaric, for his part, had changed considerably from the proud, dismissive man Alara had first encountered in his study, though traces of his old stubbornness remained, softened now by genuine humility and a willingness to admit fault that had been entirely absent when they first met. He often told visitors, with evident pride rather than embarrassment, the story of how thoroughly his wife had humbled him at his own dinner table, delighting in watching their reactions shift from polite skepticism to genuine astonishment, as Alara demonstrated, when asked, her fluency across the many languages her father had so carefully taught her. The Dowager Duchess, now settled comfortably into the role of doting grandmother-in-waiting, spent much of her time in Alara's company still, the bond formed during those early difficult weeks having only strengthened with time. She often remarked, to anyone who would listen, that hiring Alara that stormy evening remained the single wisest decision she had made in many years, and she took considerable satisfaction in having been proven right so thoroughly and so publicly. Henry Pruitt remained at Fenwick Hall as steward, his loyalty and courage during the difficult weeks of scandal, earning him a permanent place of trust and respect within the household, that no future difficulty could ever fully diminish. Alara made certain, in her new position, that his contributions were properly recognized, ensuring his family wanted for nothing, and that his years of faithful service would always be remembered and honored within the household he had served so well. One warm afternoon, several months into her new life as Duchess, Alara found herself once again in the library where so much of her quiet courtship with Alaric had unfolded, seated by the same window with a book open in her lap. Though this time the book belonged not to her father but to a small collection of children's stories written in French, intended for the tutoring of local village children she had recently begun teaching in her spare hours. Determined that no child within her new domain should ever be denied the education she herself had so nearly kept hidden forever. Alaric found her there, as he often did, and settled into the chair beside her with the easy familiarity of a man completely at peace with the life he had built. "You look thoughtful," he observed, watching her expression carefully. "I was thinking of my father," Alara admitted, setting the book aside. "Of how proud he would be, I think, to see what became of the education he gave me so quietly, so carefully, never imagining it might one day silence a room full of nobility and change the entire course of my life so completely." "He sounds as though he was a remarkable man," Alaric said gently. "He was," Alara said, smiling softly at the memory. "He always told me that knowledge kept quietly was never wasted, only waiting for the moment it was finally needed. I did not fully understand him until that night with Count Orlov, when everything I had learned in secret finally found its purpose." Alaric took her hand gently in his own, his expression warm with genuine affection. "I am endlessly grateful he taught you so well, and that you found the courage, eventually, to let the world see the fullness of what you carried within you. I know I did not deserve such patience, given how poorly I treated you when we first met." "You have more than made amends since then," Alara said warmly, "and I find I hold no bitterness at all toward the man who once called me uneducated. He taught me, in his own stumbling way, that even the proudest hearts can learn humility, given enough patience and the right teacher." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the afternoon light filtering warmly through the library windows, the estate around them alive with the quiet business of a household finally settled into genuine happiness after months of difficulty and uncertainty. Outside, in the gardens below, the sound of children's laughter drifted faintly on the breeze, the village children Alara now taught enjoying a rare afternoon of play before their lessons resumed, a small but meaningful legacy already taking root within the walls of Fenwick Hall. Years later, when Alara's own children grew old enough to ask about the small worn book of Italian poetry their mother kept always close at hand, she would tell them the story of a stormy evening long ago, of a proud duke who once dismissed her worth entirely, and of the quiet, patient courage it had taken to finally let her silence break. She would tell them of her father's teachings, of languages learned by candlelight, of a dinner table transformed by 7 simple words spoken clearly and without fear. And she would remind them always, just as her own father had once reminded her, that knowledge kept quietly is never truly wasted, only waiting patiently for its moment, ready always to rise when the world least expects it, and to change, in its own quiet and remarkable way, absolutely everything that follows. The story of Fenwick Hall's clever Duchess became, in time, a favorite tale told throughout the county, whispered admiringly among young women who dreamed of proving their own worth against the world's careless assumptions, and remembered fondly by everyone who had witnessed, firsthand, the remarkable evening a quiet companion silenced an entire dinner table, and changed the course of her own life forever, simply by finally choosing to speak. The small school Alara had begun so modestly in the village grew steadily over the years that followed, expanding from a handful of curious children gathered informally in the garden, to a proper schoolhouse built at her own insistence upon a quiet plot of land at the edge of the estate. She taught languages there herself whenever her duties allowed, insisting that every child, regardless of birth or fortune, deserved the same opportunity her father had once given her in secret, hidden away from a world that might otherwise have dismissed her potential entirely. Alaric supported the endeavor fully, often visiting the schoolhouse himself to observe the lessons, delighting in watching village children stumble happily through their first attempts at French or Latin under his wife's patient guidance. The Dowager Duchess lived long enough to see her granddaughter, Alara and Alaric's firstborn child, take her very first faltering steps across the same garden path where her parents had once shared their quiet courtship. She insisted, with characteristic firmness, that the child be taught languages from the earliest possible age, declaring proudly that no grandchild of hers would ever grow up believing education belonged only to those born into privilege and title. Alara honored that wish gladly, finding deep joy in passing along her father's careful teachings to a new generation. The quiet lessons of candlelight and patience transforming now into bright afternoons of laughter and discovery within the walls of Fenwick Hall. Lord Hume's reputation never fully recovered from the scandal that followed his scheming, and he eventually withdrew from county society altogether, settling quietly in a distant part of the country where his past misdeeds remained largely unknown. Cordelia, for her part, married eventually into a family of considerably lesser standing than she had once hoped for, and though Alara occasionally heard news of her through distant acquaintances, she found she carried no lingering resentment toward the woman who had once sought so desperately to destroy her. Time, patience, and genuine happiness had long since softened whatever bitterness those difficult early months might otherwise have left behind. Henry Pruitt remained a beloved and trusted presence at Fenwick Hall until his final years, often regaling the estate's younger staff with the story of the night he finally found the courage to speak the truth to his duke, a tale he told always with evident pride, knowing the small but crucial part he had played in ensuring justice found its proper course. Alara never forgot his kindness, and she made certain, throughout every year that followed, that his loyalty remained honored and remembered within the household he had served so faithfully. And so the halls of Fenwick Hall, once so cold and rigid beneath old certainties and careless assumptions, grew instead into a home defined by warmth, curiosity, and genuine respect, a legacy built quietly but firmly upon the courage of one remarkable young woman who had once arrived, drenched and uncertain, through a storm, carrying within her far more than anyone in that grand old house could have possibly imagined, waiting only for the right moment to finally let it be known.